Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty fascinating. How podcast appearances, particularly Donald Trump's, long free-flowing appearance on Joe Rogan's show, how that might have played a role in his 2024 election win. We've got some interesting sources for this, an MSNBC article that really digs into this whole thing, a YouTube video that breaks down Trump's appearance on Rogan, and we'll also be looking at a framework from entrepreneur Daniel Priestley. Should be pretty enlightening.
It really is interesting to see how the media landscape is changing. Podcasts are offering this direct line to voters. It's like they completely bypass all those filters and sound bites you get from traditional news outlets.
Exactly. And MSNBC is actually saying that part of Trump's win might be because of how he used podcasts to connect with younger voters. Think about it. Those are the voters who are less likely to be, watching the nightly news or reading the newspaper.
That's where the power of podcasts comes in. They create this sense of intimacy and authenticity that traditional media just doesn't have. It's less about, those polished sound bites and more about unscripted, free-flowing conversations. It allows for deeper connections to form. It's almost like you're just eavesdropping on a chat between friends.
Oh, totally. It's almost like those parasocial relationships we develop with celebrities, right? You spend 3 hours listening to Joe Rogan chat with Trump. And even though it's one-sided, you start to feel like you're getting a glimpse into the real him, like
Yeah.
you're getting to know him on a personal level.
That's a great point. It's not just about policies and platforms anymore. It's about personality relatability, forging a bond with voters that goes beyond, the typical political rhetoric. The longer the format, the more that connection can really take hold.
And speaking of Trump, he's a master storyteller, weaving narratives and painting pictures with his words. That Joe Rogan interview, it's like watching a masterclass in capturing attention.
It is, isn't it? And it's a strategy that definitely resonates with a large audience,
Yeah.
especially those who aren't plugged into those traditional media channels. But you know what I do think is interesting? MSNBC pointed out that Kamala Harris also made some podcast appearances during the campaign, but maybe not with the same strategic intent as Trump.
That's a great point. So what do you think makes a podcast appearance truly effective? What are the ingredients that elevate a guest from, just being interviewed to someone who truly connects and resonates with listeners?
That's a great question. And it's funny you should mention that because there's actually a framework for this outlined by entrepreneur Daniel Priestley. He calls them the 5 Ps of a key person of influence pitching, publishing, product profile, and partnerships.
Okay, so let's break down these T's. So pitching, would that be like Trump's ability to present his ideas, even controversial ones, in a way that captures attention? Like those moments in the Joe Rogan interview where he talks about the deep state or makes a joke about Hillary Clinton. And they weren't even planned. They were just off the cuff.
Exactly. Those are prime examples of pitching. He's using humor, bold statements, a conversational style that feels authentic, even if it might be seen as lacking some of the, typical polish of traditional politicians. This unscripted approach really did play a part in how people saw him.
Yeah, it's like on the one hand, you have the polished and scripted messaging from most politicians. And then you have Trump just going off script, talking about international relations in this casual way. Like he's just chatting at a barbecue. Did that hurt him or help him? Yes, it depends on who you ask.
Right. It's all part of his profile. And you know what? Priestley makes this really fascinating point that Trump's presidency itself was like this harbinger of a larger trend toward long-form, unscripted media. In the same way that FDR utilized radio and JFK mastered television, Trump was ahead of the curve in understanding how to use long-form conversational media to connect with people.
It's like he understood the power of these intimate, unfiltered conversations in a way that most politicians didn't. He was playing a different game. And get this, MSNBC highlighted that over 30% of Joe Rogan's listeners are young Latino men. That's a demographic that's historically been less engaged in elections. It's crazy to think about the impact those 3 hours on Rogan's show may have had, reaching a demographic that other candidates have traditionally struggled to connect with. So do you think those 3 hours on Joe Rogan's show were a game changer in the 2024 election?
It's definitely a compelling argument. By tapping into this vast and engaged audience, Trump was able to connect with voters who might have otherwise just tuned out of the political process completely. It gave his campaign a level of exposure that's hard to match through traditional media alone.
But there's got to be a potential downside to this whole long-form unscripted approach, right? Yeah. One of the things that MSNBC pointed out was the lack of fact-checking in these podcast interviews. It's like there's this risk of misinformation just spreading unchecked.
That's a really crucial point to consider. While podcasts can be incredibly powerful tools for engagement and connection, They also come with a responsibility to ensure accuracy and prevent the spread of harmful misinformation. It's a tension that we as a society are really grappling with as these new media platforms become more influential.
It makes you wonder, does the lack of fact-checking ultimately matter if the goal is to create that personal connection with voters? If a candidate comes across as authentic and relatable, are voters more likely to overlook any factual inaccuracies?
That is the million-dollar question. It really does feel like we're in uncharted territory here, trying to balance freedom of expression with the need for accountability in this new media landscape.
Definitely some food for thought. Well, we've identified some interesting points to ponder. Now let's dive a little deeper into those 5 Ps of influence that you mentioned. Can you walk us through each of them and how Trump may have put them into practice, especially with that Joe Rogan appearance?
Absolutely. Let's start with publishing, because it's not just about, showing up on any podcast. It's about strategically choosing the right platform and maximizing the reach of that appearance.
So Joe Rogan wasn't just a random choice. It was calculated.
Exactly. Rogan's show with that huge audience and a big chunk of them being young Latino men. It was the perfect platform for Trump to connect with a demographic that might not have been following him through traditional media channels. It was brilliant.
It's amazing how he was able to kind of sidestep traditional media and go straight to where the voters are, like setting up shop at a busy street fair instead of renting a storefront.
Exactly. And then you've got the product element. Think about what Trump was offering. It wasn't just policies. It was a whole image, a persona, a feeling of belonging to a movement. It's like he created this carefully crafted product, almost like a brand, and then marketed it through these long-form interviews.
It was that outsider persona, that tell it like it is attitude,
Yeah.
that really connected with people who were feeling disillusioned with the political establishment. Like people were just tired of the same old political talk.
You nailed it. And he really hammered home that image through his pitch, didn't he? Think about how he used humor and those personal anecdotes, all in a way that felt unscripted and authentic, even when he was saying things that were controversial.
It's like he was saying, hey, I'm just like you. I'm not some polished politician. I'm a regular guy.
Yeah.
And I think that really helped him connect with people on a personal level.
Yes. And that relatability was a powerful tool for building trust and loyalty with voters, especially those who are just tired of the same old polished political talk.
And then there's the final P, partnerships. How did Trump leverage that, especially on Joe Rogan's show?
Well, in this case, you could say the partnership was with Joe Rogan himself. By appearing on his show, Trump was instantly borrowing Rogan's credibility and influence with his massive audience, and it was a win-win. They both gained something from the interaction.
It's almost like an endorsement, even if it wasn't explicitly stated. I mean, if someone trusts Joe Rogan's judgment and then he has a guest on his show for 3 hours, those listeners are much more likely to be receptive to that guest's message just by virtue of being on Rogan's show.
Exactly. It was a subtle but effective way to try and sway public opinion.
Wow. Those 5 Ps really do paint a clear picture of how Trump used podcasts to his advantage. It's like we've cracked the code to his strategy.
It's a framework that can be applied to any successful influencer or public figure, understanding your strengths, finding the perfect platform, and crafting a message that really resonates with your target audience. It can be really powerful.
But we have to circle back to that issue of misinformation and the lack of fact-checking in these long-form interviews. It's a really valid point that MSNBC brought up and something we have to consider.
It's true. It is a challenge we need to acknowledge and address. The question is, how do we balance freedom of expression with the need for accountability and accuracy? Especially in a world where media is becoming increasingly fragmented and harder to control.
It's almost like we need a new set of rules for this new media game.
I agree. And those rules have to involve everyone, the
Yeah.
platforms themselves, the podcasters, and most importantly, the listeners. We have to develop those critical listening skills, be aware of our own biases, and always seek out diverse perspectives. It's not enough to just passively take in information anymore.
We can't just assume something's true just because we heard it on a podcast.
Exactly. We have to be discerning consumers of information.
So we've talked a lot about the lack of fact-checking, but do you think that lack of fact-checking actually contributed to Trump's win? Or was it just a sideshow to the bigger story of how he leveraged these long-form podcast appearances to connect with voters?
That is a really interesting question. On the one hand, you could argue that in today's political landscape where things feel so polarized, making a personal connection, being relatable, can be even more important than getting bogged down in details.
So you're saying that if someone feels like they know you, like they really get you, they're more likely to trust you and believe you, even if what you're saying is maybe a bit off?
That's certainly a possibility. And, there's a strong argument to be made that people often vote with their gut feelings and their emotions more than they vote with their head.
It's a strategy that some politicians seem to be using very effectively, but I still wonder, is it a sustainable approach? Are we sacrificing truth and accountability for these, fleeting feelings of connection?
That is the question we all need to be thinking about. It's a complex dilemma with no easy answers.
Well said. Now, we've been talking a lot about this in general terms. Let's get specific. Remember that 3-hour Joe Rogan interview that everyone's been talking about? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. The interview that launched 1,000 think pieces. We could spend 3 hours just talking about that one interview. But let's try and focus on some of the key moments and how they might have influenced voters' perceptions of Trump.
I'm all ears.
One of the things that really stood out to me in that interview was just how skillfully Trump used storytelling. He was weaving in all these personal anecdotes and experiences into his political talking points, creating this really compelling narrative that was both engaging and persuasive.
It was very clever. It was like he was saying, hey, I'm not just some talking head scouting off policies. I'm talking about real life.
Yeah.
Things that happen to me, to people I know. It made him seem more relatable, more human.
Exactly. It humanized him, made him seem more relatable, even if you didn't agree with everything he was saying. It was that classic Trumpian blend of fact and fiction, all wrapped up in this really conversational style that can be so captivating and at times a little unnerving.
It felt like he was letting you in on a secret. Like he was giving you this behind-the-scenes look at what was really going on. And, in a world where people are so distrustful of traditional institutions, that kind of message can be very appealing.
Oh, absolutely. It taps into this really deep-seated desire for authenticity and for a voice that speaks directly to people's concerns and anxieties. But, it is a slippery slope because it opens the door for conspiracy theories and unfounded claims to take root.
That's a really good point. So let's talk about those moments in the interview where Trump veered into those conspiracy theories and unfounded claims. How did those play out on Rogan's show? Did they hurt him, or did they actually reinforce that outsider image?
It's fascinating because on the one hand, those moments could have reinforced that image of him as someone who's willing to challenge the status quo, someone who's not afraid to speak truth to power, even if it means embracing controversial or fringe beliefs.
It was almost like he was saying, look, I'm not playing by their rules.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you the truth, even if it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. He positioned himself as this truth teller, but the truth that he was presenting was often distorted or completely fabricated.
And in a world where trust in institutions is so low, that message can be really seductive, especially for voters who are looking for simple explanations to complex problems.
Yeah.
Or who just feel like they've been let down by the system.
It's true. He was offering this really clear villain to blame for all of society's ills. He made everything seem so simple, black and white. And in that Rogan interview, those enemies were often the deep state, the media political opponents, all portrayed as this corrupt elite who are out of touch with the concerns of everyday Americans.
It's that classic us versus them tactic that's been used by populists throughout history. Identify the enemy, stoke people's anger and resentment, and then position yourself as the savior, the only one who can restore order and bring back prosperity.
Such a powerful strategy, and it seemed to work for Trump, at least in that context. In the Rogan interview, he came across as this champion of the people, this lone warrior fighting against the establishment. And that message really resonated with a lot of voters who were feeling disenfranchised and left behind.
It's interesting how that whole outsider image was amplified by the casual conversational setting of the podcast. It just felt like you were sitting there listening to a friend vent their frustrations. Very relatable.
That's the genius of the podcast format. It creates this sense of intimacy and shared experience that you just don't get with the typical formality of, traditional political discourse. And that feeling of connection can be incredibly powerful, especially when it's combined with a message that taps into people's deepest fears and aspirations.
It's like mixing those fears and aspirations into this potent cocktail that voters are just eager to drink up. And Trump was like the master mixologist.
He really was. And, I think we'll see other politicians try to recreate that same recipe for success as they figure out how to navigate this new media landscape.
So we've talked about the strategies, the messaging, the potential risks. But what about the impact? Did Trump's podcast appearances actually sway voters? Do you think they really contributed to his victory in the 2024 election?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's impossible to say for sure whether his podcast strategy was the deciding factor, but it was a key element that definitely played a role in shaping public perception, especially among certain demographics.
We keep coming back to that statistic from MSNBC that under 30% of Joe Rogan's listeners are young Latino men. It's a demographic that's historically been less engaged in elections.
And by going on Rogan's show, Trump was able to connect with voters who might not have even been paying attention to the election otherwise. He bypassed the filters of traditional media and delivered his message directly to this demographic.
It's like he found this secret passageway right into their living rooms. No gatekeepers, no filters, just direct access.
And we can't forget about the impact on his existing supporters. Those appearances helped mobilize them, reinforce their beliefs, get them excited to go out and vote.
It was like a virtual rally, a way to bring his followers together and create this sense of community and shared purpose, even though they were scattered all over the country.
Exactly. It was all about fostering that sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than yourself. And that feeling of belonging, especially when combined with a message that feeds into people's grievances and fuels their desire for change, can be incredibly motivating.
It seems like Trump's podcast strategy was this multi-pronged attack, reaching new voters, mobilizing existing supporters, and really shaping the narrative around his candidacy.
He covered all the bases, and his success is really a sign of the times. We're in this new era of political communication, and long-form unscripted media is becoming a driving force.
It's exciting and a little unsettling, to be honest.
Yeah,
We're seeing this huge shift in how we consume and process political information.
it's true. And it raises a lot of questions about the future of fact-checking, accountability, and the role of traditional media.
So much to think about. But that's what we love about the Deep Dive, exploring these complex topics, challenging assumptions, and giving our listeners the tools to be informed and engaged citizens.
Well said. So, listener, we leave you with this. Our podcast, The Future of Political Discourse. And if so, how do we ensure that this powerful medium is used responsibly and ethically? Think about that, and we'll see you on our next Deep Dive.
Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep listening.